is not about idea generation or creativity. It's about search. Sometimes scanning, searching, I can't call it. It's been actively looking for what's possible. Yeah? And part of that's technology, part of it's markets, part of it's other things. Okay? So the key thing in this is a bundle of ways of trying to identify initially more sources of innovation and then to look for patterns or connections. Because most real innovations are the coming together of several streams. Okay? It's not a focal demographic or a focal piece of technology. Often it's several things coming together, which together is the combination that creates often the novelty and the value. Okay? So the verb there is about searching. So examples, again, I'm not going to go around this, but basically these are different sources, plural, of innovation. And often most organisations consider one or two. They might talk to their suppliers, yeah? They might have an internal knowledge management system or something, but they very rarely exhaust or explore the whole range of things. Some are more, yeah, inspiration's still there, it happens. But the trick, even with inspiration, is being sensitive to, so what? What can we do about it? And it's true, a lot of innovations you can track back to a accident, serendipity. Yeah? But the really interesting thing is, how did those guys then realise there was potentially something that was interesting from that? Because most people walk past these things. Yeah? So, right from invention of electricity and vulcanized rubber, a lot of these were accidents in the sense people were fiddling around and something happens that surprised them, and then they have to make sense of it. What could we do with that? Yeah? So the guys who discovered vulcanized rubber were looking for ways of making latex more stable, so it was a search, a focused search, but the way they did it in terms of spilling it on the hot plate was an accident. But the really interesting story is they missed the opportunity. They couldn't figure out what the point was. They changed its properties, but so what? What can we do with that? Next. Yeah? And it requires whole new people to come along and say, that has different properties. What could we do with that? Yeah? And you often get that disconnect because people aren't sensitized to even serendipity. What could happen next? The example of electricity, the first dry cells, batteries, like we've got in all our machines there. What were the first applications of not dry cells, wet cells, batteries? Invented in France, I think it's the last invention ever in France, was, well, edit that one out now. But what were the first applications? The people who actually invented the first wet cells, first batteries. What do you think it was? Was it electrification of lights? No, they came a century later, something. It was circuses, electrocuting people at circuses for almost 22 years or something. They were taking around big packs of these cells, and people from the audience come along and be electrocuted. Yeah? That was it. Nobody could figure out what to do with it. And so often these sort of innovations come along, and innovations, and people just don't know. So a lot of innovation is being sensitive to what does it do, and what could we do with that? And there's often a big disconnect, and often it's a different individual, a different group, or a different company that realises the potential of what's possible. So what we're trying to do is break that disconnection. Users, innovators, a big deal at the moment. There's lots of tools and techniques to try to internalise, particularly things like online communities, trying to get expertise from those and internalise those and capture some of that knowledge. Because often people participate on a voluntary basis. Some accidents we spoke about. Watching others, ethnographic studies. A lot of the big consultancies outfits, that's what they do. You write a big check, and they say, you want to innovate? Yes. What do you want? Give us a brief. And then they go watch people. Yeah? Like ethnographic anthropologists. They look around, watch people in their sort of natural environment, whether it be an office or a nursery or whatever.
Or like Samsung and iPhone.
Can you elaborate? I mean, we're going to talk about that later, so we don't want to start a fight too early, but it is a bit like religion and football teams, isn't it? How do you mean?
Samsung copied the technology of the iPhone, the screens,
No, I'm not talking. No, okay, good point. Okay, I get what you're saying. Okay, I'm not talking about. We'll talk about imitation later. I'm not talking about imitation, legally or otherwise. We'll discuss that in the next session, actually. But we're talking about actually observing people, how they work, what they do, yeah, and how they might use an innovation in a real environment. So rather than in a lab or something. So observation. Recombinant innovation, a tedious term That means it's not my diagram. Tedious term. It's called many other things, architectural innovation and all that sort of. Basically, it means what we've been talking about, seeing these connections. Yeah? A lot of innovations, I include things like the iPhone, are not new. You can literally decompose it into, say, well, that's 10 years old, operating system 24 years old, that screen somebody else developed, those chipsets are developed by ARM, they're built in Taiwan, but together, yeah, it's something really quite clever. Now that's a physical example of that, but there are many other examples where innovation is this connection, seeing these new novel connections. And that's, I don't care what you call it, recombinant's a bit of a clumsy term, but a lot of innovation are these connections, seeing connections that others don't see, yeah, and then figuring out how you can create value from that. So expand the horizon beyond the sort of it's all about ideas or R&D or creativity. And there are lots of techniques which we're not going to go into. They're all available, as we say, on the website. Yeah, about the website, by the way, it's not a commercial break because the website doesn't generate any income. That's a bad move, wasn't it? But it's an open site, as you probably know if you had a look. You've got the links and the URL there. But the toolkit's getting bigger and bigger, and we've got about 100 tools now. And basically you can say, okay, I'm trying to figure out how I search for innovation, or I'm trying to figure out how I forecast, trying to figure out how I work with partners. And you can then begin to identify clusters of tools that might help you do that. Okay? But I repeat, without a process, tools don't work very well, and without organisational climate, the process doesn't work very well. But it's useful to say, well, how do I actually do this? Yeah, and drill it down to a sort of toolkit. Okay, so how do we bring that all together? Well, going back to this idea of innovation strategy, really, is that given the range and sources of innovation, is to encourage a sort of, a large number of these inputs and then to try to make sense of that. To have debate, which would go back to the climate issue. If you have too much consensus about how the world works and what's important, you miss stuff, yeah? You either don't see it when it's out there, or you see it and you dismiss it. It's not relevant, okay? And so being sensitive to what can be possible. So one is sensitization and applying these tools and techniques. Whole range of forecasting stuff, we don't worry about that. Yeah, that's interesting because it fits my universal graph. So, I ask you a question. You're seeking some technology externally, because we're saying, look, don't necessarily have to reinvent this stuff. You need to search and look for it. So you're looking out there and trying to figure out how could we use some technology. So, for example, I'll give you an example. Nintendo, Japanese games company, ... used to make playing cards. That's not relevant. That's just to keep you attentive. Nintendo's most successful product ever, to date anyway, was the Wii. Yeah, the current one's not so clever, but the previous Wii, for many reasons, yeah, it attracted non-gaming markets. It made money on consoles, not just games. A whole bunch of firsts. Yeah, so whether it's luck or not, we don't know yet because they haven't followed through, but it may have been. But some of the smart things they did, in terms of segmenting non-users, that's very clever. But in terms of the technology, one of the things they did was to create an interface that was more intuitive. Yeah? So you didn't need gamers' thumbs and such like and lots of training. So that was a very clever thing. Now the downside was they didn't have the technical resources of their competitors, Sony and Microsoft, who have very deep technical pockets. So they had to try to develop or acquire a technology that could create this new interface for non-gamers. So what did they do? What did they do? Or what would you advise them to do based on our model? Yeah?
Open platform?
Open platform, but more precisely, what would you advise them based on our new singing or dancing process model? What would be your advice? Now they don't have the R&D internally to do this.
Alliance?
Outsource is a sort of bit like saying automate. It's a sort of a nice envelope to get rid of the problem. Yeah.
Development community? Developer?
Looking for experts in the field of how to interact with an
Yeah, you could, rather than, you're right, an alternative to set up a development community such that. But before you need to do that, there's a lot of stuff out there. Yeah? There's a whole reservoir, if that's the right, it's not the right terminology, but I've been watching The Return too much. Whole reservoir, okay, of technology, often unused or uncommercialised. So before you set up your own communities or outsource, trouble with outsourcing, you have to specify what you want, and by definition, you don't have the internal R&D to do it. So it becomes problematic. You get this, what do they call it, moral hazard that suppliers do bad things. So you would look, you start to search out there, what's out there, what could help us and such like, yeah?